I find myself sort of interested with the concept of maturity. Not really like, you know, ooh, it's so mature, but like I find myself interested in concepts where it's hard to delineate what's mature versus what's immature. Sort of like social constructions. What's female, what's not female. What's male, what's not male. Then, so maturity, basically, if you define it in sort of terms of media, is what is it? Drugs, language, sex, violence. DLSV, right? And so sex includes nudity, technically. Sexual content. And so sex is inferred to be when you're not wearing clothes. Now, based off of this binary, I find the clothes wearing part more interesting. Like, what if instead of rated S for like sexual content, you rated it S for they have dashikis on, huh? There's a sort of, or maybe rate it S for like heavily implied hot bod, because it's like that Seinfeld episode where she's wearing like a very thick coat. Or was that How I Met Your Mother? I forget. And that brings me to another thing, which is, so drugs, language, sex, and violence. This doesn't actually really, you know, I think if you actually want to like rate something as like mature or immature, I'd just say like, is it bad or good? Basically, does it spread bad or good messages? So then drugs, I guess you could see as like being glorified in certain content, but arguably anything you sort of say like, don't do drugs, it's bound to have a certain subsection of people more encouraged to do that than disencouraged if you just have it like that sort of like one tone and not like a nuanced tone like people do drugs because they're depressed and then they get a dependency on drugs. So on that basis, I'd say that really violence is the only one that makes sense, because language, I mean, language can to a certain extent be bad, but I wouldn't say language as like curse words is bad. It can be much more insidious than that. Like, you could say plenty of Hallmark movies on like what is it, the Lifetime channel, are mature in a certain way in which they're really indoctrinated in a certain sort of viewpoint, like Christian suburban mom in like a town with 20,000, 30,000 people, which, you know, half city, half rural, not quite suburban. Like, what? There was this one movie, I forget, there was a woman reviewing it, talking about Lifetime channels, and she was talking about this woman who fell in love with an elevator operator, and so she was like, oh, do I leave my town or to work in the big city, or do I work as an elevator operator? It might have been, I think it was some black woman comedian on Comedy Central. Ooh, hey cat. Look, it's the cat. How are you doing, cat? And so she was like, shut the fuck up about this shit, yo. Like, there's elevators in the city. You were paid to be an elevator operator in this town that has like the biggest building is 2 floors. Really. And it's like really elevator operator. It's like, what are we watching? Like Jack Lemmon in whatever that movie is, where he like gives his boss the key to sleep with that woman, and he falls in love with a woman. And there's this Jewish neighbor who's like, "You're a real mensch now. I give you credit for that. Be a real mensch." So, yeah, that's a weird thing about language. With sex, it's like, I mean, we're all gotten here with sex. So here's a weird thing. So I have a sort of generation gap in my family, right? So drugs, language, sex, and violence. My family in general is sort of alcoholic. You know, I don't know how that sort of pans out over families. Who's a sort of closet alcoholic? Who's like, you know, able to sort of keep appearances? Who isn't? Who it's more sort of like socially cohesive with the environment, or more social drinkers, versus where like maybe violence is tolerated more, so you see a drinker and you see violence and you think that's normal. Like, I'm reminded sort of Smoke Signals, where there's a scene where so, you know, in the Native American, Indian, native, you can just call them natives, I guess, or they can just call themselves that, but it's more sort of confusing when you but so the one kid, where the plot of the movie is he's going down to Arizona or something like that to get his dad's ashes, and they show a flashback scene where his dad gets angry and like hits him. Then right after that scene, he like drives away because he's ashamed of himself as a father. And then there's sort of all these like spiritual images around it, like his one friend, Lucas something, who talks like this. If you want to know the story about the bench that is right there, I will tell you it. That bench was put there by somebody, I don't know, but I've seen a similar bench in my other grandparents' home, but it's not there any longer for some reason. I don't know. You know, he speaks with that sort of like prosody of Native American, where like the syllables are all more similar length. But anyway, so the other guy's dad goes to his friend, who that friend is annoying, and it kind of reminds me of my relationship with my brother, where I'm like talkative, and then the other guy is sort of like, you gotta be a manly guy, you gotta intimidate people, and the other guy has like glasses and ponytails, and he's like, why would I want to do that? And they encounter like an Olympic skier or gymnastic girl, and so the one guy's like, oh really, you were in the Olympics? And then his friend is like, yeah, you're a fucking liar. And so it sort of explores how basically, I guess, the son has a sort of like violent demeanor, or a sort of just aggressive, passive aggressive, sort of stand your ground demeanor from his dad, because he's sort of coded in himself like, you know, you gotta have self-respect, and you have to have self-respect, you can't be like gregarious and all sort of like sort of fawning. So it's an interesting look at social dynamics in there. But my point is basically that drugs are like a complex thing. I wouldn't say like just drugs are inherently sort of mature. It's more like how they're used, which is complicated in and of itself.
Soap opera with zombies. Like the zombies were barely there. It was so annoying and so slow.
And so the maturity ratings make you think, well, if kids aren't allowed to watch mature things, then where might they sort of like, you know, lose the plot? There's certain ways you can translate more mature themes to kids, right? Like, a lot of animation does this, a lot of fairy tales do this. I liked a lot of fairy tales when I was young, and I think, I don't know, fairy tales are fairly violent. There's people chopping off heads.
Stephen Young's character trying to like be roped down into the well, like as if that the whole plan's so stupid because they're like, we have to kill the zombie because it's going to infect the water. Like he's fucking living in the well, like it's already zombie soup. What are you planning on doing? Like they're trying to like drag it out, like we're gonna like carry.
So drugs, language, sex, and violence. It's not that simple. It's just, I guess, a sort of image of don't act like this, but that's not really a surefire like way. It's just kind of the sort of events loosely associated with bad people. And does this give us a sort of weird view of bad people? Because if you figure serial killers, they're not like typically the most sort of libertine people. They're sort of more like just reserved. They might be even like Puritan sexually. A lot of them are seen as that, but they still have perversions. A lot of them might be like very anti-drug, very proper in language, and but I don't know. It's just weird. Like, what's gonna traumatize you, I guess, is also an important thing. So, like, you don't want to traumatize a kid, but I'm not sure I've ever heard of a kid being traumatized by just, like, media, you know, because as soon as you, like, get that it's not real. Have you ever heard of anything like that, listener, viewer? Because I haven't. I mean, maybe if you have, like, an abusive situation where the person plays it over and over and they don't talk to the person about the content. Maybe if you're, like, playing Rage Against the Machine at, like, 1,000 decibels at Guantanamo or something like that, but otherwise, it doesn't seem like a thing that would happen to be traumatized. And I almost feel like, you know, you might sort of like reverse cause and effect. To blame victims for a second, because who doesn't like that? How can you tell, like, where something is sort of traumatic, you know, inherently, and where some person likely to be quote-unquote traumatized by media? And in a way, what would you rather have? Them be traumatized by media, or them be traumatized in real life? Looking at it from a utilitarian viewpoint of, I mean, you're not likely to go through your life without trauma. Perhaps then you look at sort of criminology and how victims are sort of typified, and maybe people would serve well to be sort of traumatized in controlled environments. But, you know, as far as like who wants what for who. I suppose I don't really mind like different types of people being in the world, like some sort of like prudes and shit. You know, it's all dialectic, and so I can't really argue against it. The only way that it would stop is if one, people realize that was dumb shit, which I think people are realizing more nowadays, or two, if I became the dictator of the United States and I kidnapped every child to be a child soldier and a child genius and like a ward of the state, which would be cool. That's basically what Evangelion is. But yeah, my question was, so besides, like, I get it, like, drugs, language, sex, violence, I don't think necessarily that any of those shouldn't be considered mature, because I can see, like, each, you know, comes at a certain developmental point where, you know, young people, like children and teenagers, can do harm because they really don't have, like, a moral compass, or they're sort of like, they don't know the consequences of their actions. Like, they don't fully get how consequences work, so they might over exaggerate one way or the other. And from there you get plenty of movies about, like, kids killing their friends and being like, oh shit, and then they kill others among their friends, like, probably a few Japanese movies like this, like, Confessions is sort of like that. Confessions. What else? But then I also remember this one English movie. Might have taken place in Oregon or something like that. But so, this is a sort of, I was just wondering, right? Because drugs, you know, that can kind of mess you up as a kid, but who cares? The Swans, Michael Gira did a bunch of drugs. Language, that's something that can become, you know, you can be racist as a kid or like homophobic as a kid, but then sort of like once you've grown up as an adult, your language matters more than when you're playing Call of Duty. Sex, you know, kids aren't very sexually developed, they're not very socially developed, so the sexual relations they have are more sort of torrid. They're probably less likely to be comfortable with it. Comfort is something that sort of like develops over time, and there's sorts of really, you know, sort of giving birth is of, you could see it in a way as equal moral importance to killing somebody. But then violence, you know, that's also bad. And, you know, I don't know, that seems less, I guess adults are engaged in violence. It seems less like something where it becomes more appropriate to do once you're an adult. I think kids are okay at violence. I think they're fairly fine. Although you probably shouldn't give a kid a gun or anything like that, so I can see that. So, what I was wondering to end off this video is, if you were to add a fifth or even more categories to this, what would it be? To complete it, to sort of fill in the gaps. Because I see it as sort of incomplete, because as is, it seems very materially oriented. I don't know, maybe mental illness, something like that, which, I don't know. That's a video.